Jeremy from Playful, talking about the importance of play testing in a discoverability constrained environment. Great for having you. The virtual floor is yours.
Fantastic. Let me just make sure I'm pointing to the right things. How does that look your end?
That looks beautiful. Thank you.
Excellent, and thanks for that introduction. Yeah, being part of Playside would have been interesting. It might have been a very different talk, but I get to talk about playtesting, which is something that I've
just in my defense, I think the reason I probably said it is because I'm currently organizing their Gamescom stand, and so I've been talking to Playside a lot, and we're just in the process of finalizing everything. So my subconscious is probably just wants to make sure that that's all
That's
properly
okay.
done. No, I'm really sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. It's a good association to have, right? Okay, so can everybody see the presentation? Is that good? Yep.
Yep, perfect.
Cool. I guess first thing is just a big thanks to IGF for hosting this wonderful event and obviously supporting the next wave of gaming professionals. We see playtesting as a bit of a superpower, and that's sort of really been echoed through a lot of the conversations we've had with studios over the last year. By way of a quick introduction, my name's Jeremy. I have been part of a team that has published, and with the same team, we changed focus and founded Playful, more as a bit of a need, and I'll talk a little bit about our journey in a bit. Hopefully the conversation today will be quite practical, a little bit educational, and definitely a little bit conversational. And at the end, as all the other sessions previous, open to questions around playtesting as a whole. Every game benefits from fresh player perspectives. Today's session isn't just about playtesters, it's actually about developers as well, or wannabe studios, as well as those that are just interested in playtesting as another form of actually helping studios out. We'll look at practicing or focusing on practical takeaways that hopefully people can look at using immediately. So, Playful. As I mentioned, we have been developers. My team has actually developed. We were new, which means that we had the benefit of going and walking all the hard yards and figuring out all the wrong steps and the corrections that sort of surround those sort of steps. We talked to funding agencies, we sort of presented ideas, had ideas shot down, refined ideas, and went through probably what a lot of you are going through. Where we've ended up is a shift into the independent playtesting specialist. We focus primarily on indie studios and mid-size studios, largely because through our own experience, we felt that there wasn't enough services out there supporting this space. There are other playtesting services out there, but they tend to be really active with the really big titles. And so a lot of the newer titles, the ones that are starting off, tend to not have access, which ended up being one of our biggest challenges, is getting access to playtesters, setting up a program, being able to turn those sessions around quickly so they become quite meaningful. As part of our process, we set up structured observation. We don't just click opinions, we look for patterns. And we support studios from prototype right through to launch to help them make better decisions overall. Why we exist. Like I said, through our journey, we experienced how hard it is to get that feedback. Particularly over the last 5 years, the narrative for publishers, for funders has all changed. Where vertical slice tended to be the first moment where you start sharing your title, studios and publishers are now starting to demand player validation, player feedback much earlier in that process, which has really changed the game quite a bit. Being able to test your idea put it out there, get player feedback, is actually quite a powerful thing, and actually opens up the conversation in more meaningful ways. So as I said, we didn't start out as a playtesting company, but our journey meant that we felt that we were better suited to actually serve this niche. Player feedback is valuable. It's high amongst the requirements based on the rest of the industry. And it was really only from watching players interact with their own projects that we realized that the real opportunity for us wasn't actually building another game. It was actually helping other studios understand their players better, and ultimately helping other studios deliver great games, which is where we sort of found our passion. Every decision that is made at a studio has generally been driven by player feedback. Developers end up knowing their games way too well, as you'd expect. So therefore, they don't see what players see. Players look through a different lens when they're engaging with their titles. Sorry, I've got a message saying I'm cutting out. Maybe I'll just slow down. What we look at doing is creating better observations for studios to actually aid better decisions going forward. We see playtesting as a bit of a superpower. Great games are not actually refined, are refined but not actually guessed. You don't just happen on something, you actually work hard at it, and feedback is part of that. We look at validating those assumptions for studios. We look at creating or mitigating risk for studios through playtesting. Sometimes it's those small observations that actually lead to really big improvements in people's titles. Just recently I spoke to an Australian studio who, at the end of the conversation, I turned around and they were avid playtesters, which sadly I don't see a lot of. They indicated that on every title that they ship, they test between 200 and 300 times from a playtesting standpoint. And when I asked, they turned around and said they actually see playtesting as their secret sauce. It's not the thing that differentiates them from a competitor standpoint. It's the thing that reduces risk. It's the thing that sets expectations and understands how their game is going to be received in the marketplace. I found it quite inspiring that someone goes to that sort of length to understand how players resonate with their title, and actually go to great lengths to actually uncovering all that feedback. And like I said, they see that as their special source for success. So what do they test? Largely, they're validating their ideas before investing further. They are looking at reducing player friction. Sometimes players don't always articulate what their challenges are, but by watching them play, you're able to actually understand. Observing allows you to see those friction points. And overall for studios, it allows you to build a level of confidence in the design decisions that you're applying, meaning that you can actually, at the end of the day, feel like nothing's wasted and you can move a lot faster. One thing that I've heard a lot on our journey is this comparison between QA and playtesting. And I guess they're both important, but they're also very different. They ask different questions and they demand different answers. QA is about whether something works. It's about finding bugs. It's technical. It's almost binary in terms of it has a pass and a fail. Whereas playtesting asks how it feels. It looks at player state, player behavior. It looks to find friction and understand the why. Both answer very different questions, but both of them are equally important in delivering your titles. QA protects quality. Playtesting protects the experience. Technical quality doesn't always guarantee a great experience, but together they actually reduce the development risk. When we started, we heard lots of myths about playtesting, common misconceptions. I know we were guilty ourselves. You know, when you're first starting off, friends and family tend to be your go-to. We were reminded by several people that friends tend to always give you the best feedback, particularly if it's your mum. Everything you do is perfect. You need friends and family have a place, but actually, if you're looking to validate, you need to broaden that amount of exposure on your title. The other myth is testing closer to launch. Actually, there's lots of opportunities to test very early in the process. The earlier you test, the more valuable your decisions come because they run much longer and you're not having to change your outcomes. Testing near launch largely gives you a very limited window to only deal with the burning buildings. And sometimes not everything can be saved, or sometimes if you're not giving yourself enough time, you can't actually make the changes that will impact or make a positive impact on your launch. The other misconception is that only large studios playtest. And what I'm seeing, which is really positive for where we're sitting, is actually lots of studios are starting to playtest. And that's really encouraging to listen to your users, to get that feedback, and then to temper that feedback and apply it in a more meaningful way, means that actually games are just going to, the quality of games are just going to end up increasing. And that can only be good for the industry. And the other myth is that people only tell us what they like. And from the tests that we've done, and we've done hundreds and hundreds of hours now, people don't. People will tell you the positive, they'll tell you the negative. Where we support our community is more thinking out loud and talking about the things that they expect. Not necessarily what they're doing. So if they push on a button and they expected a certain outcome, if that surprised them, that sort of feedback is actually really valuable. The other one, which actually isn't on this list, is that only experienced people can playtest. In our community, we have playtests that only have a few hundred hours on a genre through to those 10,000 plus masters. All of those playtesters are valuable. They give studios a different insight. Studios sometimes only want certain types of testers to test certain types of functions. So being able to sort of pick and choose who tests and for what purpose is really important. So don't think just because you haven't got a lot of hours in a certain genre means that you can't contribute meaningfully to a studio's outcome. That's actually not true. As I mentioned, playtesting has two sides. Studios and publishers are looking to turn insights into stronger player experiences. So very commercial, but they're listening to player feedback in order to adopt and adjust their title to maximize launch. Where playtesters provide that real-world perspective, it helps improve games overall. Everything starts with players, whether you're trying to sell them or you're trying to get feedback. But everything ends with a better player experience when those two work together. Both audiences are actually essential in delivering a well-tested solution. The playtester mindset, when people sit down to play, really what we're looking for is people just to be honest. Think out loud, be natural. Don't try to play well, just play the game. Think out loud wherever possible, stay curious, and honest reactions actually add a lot more value to playing someone's game than perfect gameplay. Studios like to see where people stumble, fall, where they failed on that boss, for the 10th, 11th, 12th time, what they're struggling on. That's the sort of feedback that allows them to review and balance bosses or look at their first-time user experience and actually refine it for more clarity. Those are the sort of gems that actually raise to the surface and allow titles to improve. So what makes a great playtester? Clear communication. Absolutely. Reliability overall in terms of delivery. Attention to detail in terms of what they're doing. constructive feedback. It's all too easy, particularly those that are in the industry, to go from an experiential piece of feedback to a technical piece of feedback. And as much as that may be useful, there's sort of places for that sort of thing. And then overall, just respecting confidentiality. Studios share their titles, look for feedback in order to improve their title. They don't want to find their game on YouTube and what's wrong with it, because most of this process is a moving feast. There's lots of talk even today about iteration. Mistakes will happen, review, refinement, and then sharing again actually really goes a long way. With the studio mindset is about observing behaviors. They want to avoid leading their players and actually be observational. It isn't about proving that they are right. It's about listening to how they can improve what they've got. And then to use that feedback to have constructive studio conversations about what's next. How do they take that feedback and implement it into something meaningful? We've worked with studios. I mentioned earlier about leaving tests till just before launch. We actually work with studios where playtesting starts as early as concept. You may have a grey box level, some gameplay mechanics. You have enough to start testing something very specific. I think the Advance in the last one talked about finding the fun, finding those mechanics and elevating those. You can do that at grey box, but you can then start building on that momentum through prototype for your vertical slice, alpha and beta, and then up to launch. You can also look at playtesting beyond launch, looking at things like retention, your first-time user experience, once you're starting to get some quantity coming through. Playtesting isn't exclusively just before launch. There's actually a lot to learn through your development pipeline. And in some cases, the earlier you learn some of these things, depending on what it is, it actually mitigates that risk and sometimes can save you hundreds of hours of development on something that maybe is never going to work. So it ends up, in some cases, actually being cheaper in the long run, depending on where you start. Obviously, bear in mind that different stages will answer different questions. You're doing grey box, you're looking at the gameplay mechanics, the loops, maybe some level stuff. But as you get further and further into your development pipeline, you can actually start to broaden the type of experiences you test, the sort of information that you actually gather, and some of the decisions that you actually want answered by player feedback. So some of the things you can test, and some of these things are pretty obvious. The first-time user experience is obviously one where a lot of studios put a lot of time, but you can also test core mechanics, specifically the difficulty. Was the boss easy, hard? Did many people pass it? How many people gave up? Progression overall through your game, multiplayer or co-op. How does the player dynamic work? Did players actually co-op and actually solve those problems, or did they have different shinings that they ended up focusing on? Accessibility, usability. So there's actually quite a lot that you can actually test, as well as just the game as a whole in terms of more experiential. So depending on where you are, you might want to use some of those levers more appropriately and not test everything, but actually allow you to focus and allow your teams to actually then really hone on specific problems that they're trying to have solved. And then what we do is we take all that data, we actually look for patterns rather than opinions. One person's voice may be interesting, but when you've got a pattern starting to form, it's actually when you start to be able to see some of the challenges that are coming, that are actually starting to surface. Individual comments can potentially mislead. Reoccurring patterns actually provide a level of evidence for studios to then prioritize their feedback, their improvements. Playtesting data is assessed, and importantly, it's prioritized by studios based on what they're trying to achieve. Negative feedback, which you obviously get in playtesting sessions, doesn't automatically mean more effort. It needs to be contextualized with what the studio is going to solve. Negative feedback may wave a flag, it may actually give you an indicator, but it doesn't necessarily mean more work. And you kind of need both in order to sort of balance decision making. In terms of how we approach it at Playful, we generally break our playtest into 5 steps. Getting started, recruitment phase of it, the play, analysis, and reporting. So we try and keep it as simple as possible. Getting started is all about understanding what the studios are trying to achieve, what they're trying to learn. It helps us develop their survey. So we're asking the right questions so that they're pointed and meaningful. It also helps us identify the right sort of people to engage in any sort of play test. It defines the research outcomes so that we can actually get rid of the noise and actually focus on the goals. We then go into recruitment. And finding the right players is always really important. Now, the right player could be a mix of anybody, depending on what the studio is trying to achieve. It could also mean that they're after very targeted, very specific players. You know, you've got a hardcore game, you want hardcore players. You know, this is where the 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 players are really going to shine. Those that have played the titles within that genre are going to be able to really meaningful contribute to the conversation overall. We typically start our recruitment internally. So we have a community that's been growing. We're just short of a year and heading towards and not far off about 1,000 members. Within those members, we have a really broad array of segmentation that we can lean on. And we can sort of carve those users up relative to what the studio is after. If we can't find the type of player that the studio is after, we then look to recruit through our various networks. And we sort of put a call out. We recently had a call where a studio was looking for a very specific tactical shooter player. And they had created this amazing chart of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 players and the sort of titles that they would play relative to the title that they were building. We didn't quite meet our minimum requirements and actually put a call out and recruited for those specific players. So recruitment in leading up to a play test is a viable way of actually getting the right players for studios for onboarding. Additionally, we can augment our recruitment with existing studios. Some of the mid-tier studios already have a large community, and so we can actually onboard their community and make them part of our process, which actually solves another problem. Not only studios benefit from cost savings, but also some of those early upfront learnings already have been discounted because most of the player base will already have experience with their title. So they can actually start focusing on very task-specific roles within their titles and actually sort of get to that secret sauce much sooner. And that allows us to sort of continue to support both the studio's playtesting community, but also sort of allow that relationship to leverage the finding of those key discoveries. We also, in some cases, actually use our community to recruit for us. We recently did a co-op play test, and just to be a little bit different, what we ended up doing is asking our community who they would like to play with. What that did is actually remove that awkwardness of two players playing with each other who haven't played before, and actually just got very quickly to that rhythm you have when you're playing with your mates. The game still may be challenging. It might not be something that they are, something they're comfortable with or have played before. But what it does mean is that the player dynamic, the player behaviour becomes very natural. They'll call their mates out for doing silly things in the game, and that's where actually we can start to actually move that forward quite quickly for the studio in that focus. So it's a new way that we're looking at in terms of recruitment, but already is starting to show some dividends in removing that player awkwardness when you're playing with someone brand new and actually getting straight to building on and maintaining that rhythm. Once onboarding is complete, for anyone joining the community, we look at paying all our testers. So effectively, everyone within our community gets the opportunity to play and get paid, which means that we can keep everything as professional from start to finish as possible. Then we get into the analysis side of things. From a play side of things, we typically support remote sessions for all our playtesting. Not all studios do. Sometimes they have moderated sessions in a lab. We are exploring moderated sessions, but we found that with remote playtesting, what that allows us to do is to segment by culture or country much faster than a moderated session. And then by proxy, studios actually make some significant savings through that method. The sessions typically last about an hour. We find that after about an hour of play, we're starting to see saturation in sort of the feedback that we're getting, particularly if we're quite focused on what the outcomes are. We have had sessions run much longer. I think we just recently did a 3-hour session, but those sessions are geared up for a very different outcome and play through. But typically a session will last for about an hour and run from anything from about 20 up to about 40 participants, depending again what the studio is actually after. Most of our testing at the moment, not by design, is sort of leveraging the Steam infrastructure. It means that our community is very easy to engage with, and more importantly, that the studios can actually distribute their builds much easier. So it means that we can get from establishing what we need to actually getting people playing in a much quicker time frame overall. And then we, as part of the session, all players deliver a video as part of their deliverable and also complete a survey, which we use as one of our inputs. The analysis generally is supporting multiple data sources. We mentioned video, so typically we have hours upon hours upon hours of video footage to work through. We also supplement that with segmentation data, so studios can understand who they've played, where they're from, how much experience they've had in the game genre, what age they are, so that that definition will allow studios to actually look at the data and apply it relative to what they're trying to achieve. There may be additional inputs if we are running a co-op test. We also look at player behavior, their interactions, as a separate metric that studios can then actually use to drive conversation. The videos themselves get used twice, both for key observations. They're reviewed and they're also used to support studio engagement downstream. But they're also converted into transcripts to allow us to identify in a slightly more expeditious way behavior patterns. Mentioned the segmentation data that gives us that broad understanding of who has played, but we also then do surveys, survey data. Typically they are run in 2 parts. The first part is specifically targeted at player experience. It's roughly about 25 questions, and they are using a universal data model, which allows studios to not only understand their own player experience, or the own experience for their players, but also allows you, which is really cool, to take that data and to go online and compare your title against other titles within the same genre that have run that particular test. So you could compare your platform against maybe one of the standout platformers over the last 3 to 5 years who have gone through the same process. So you can compare your experience in a more like-for-like sort of manner. In addition to that, the other half of the survey actually supports studio-led questions, questions that help tease out direct responses that support key playtesting objectives for the studio. And then the last step is reporting. We offer a range of different reporting options for studios. The most common one is what we call the complete report, where all the data is synthesized into 10 key development pillars. They've sort of been purposely structured that way to allow slightly bigger teams or teams with individuals that have very specific requirements to be able to tease out that information relative to their discipline. So some of the disciplines that, some of the pillars that we actually analyze data against are things like user interface, game mechanics, of course, controllers or controls, visual design, narrative design, audio, but also things like retention or performance. And we look at all the feedback and actually sort of curate it based on those pillars. We also use a secondary data model called the 5-player traits, which is part of our reporting process. I guess for those, I'm pretty sure all of you have come across the slightly older Bartles player profiling model. We originally started with that, but have recently, working with a local university, looked at adopting the new 5-player trait model, which basically doesn't define players so harshly and actually gives them metrics based on 5 key dimensions or 5 core dimensions, which include, if my memory serves, social, aesthetic, narrative, challenge, and goal setting. And so that'll tell you from a player perspective, individual players, what their preference is. Are they more goal driven? Are they more into the aesthetics of a game? So when you are looking at player feedback, you can actually temper that feedback with what sort of player they are. If they are more of a social player, but they're commenting on narrative, you can actually, as a studio, make those calls in terms of their value or their reference against their player type. And as I mentioned, the player experience on the PXI model is also the other one that we report on and from the survey that we collect all the data. We also provide largely through conversation with studios, data on demand. So where we may analyze and report on stuff, we also provide timestamps which lead back to the videos that allow studios to scrub 30 seconds before or 30 seconds past a comment that was made to be able to create an even greater context around certain contexts or certain comments. So all the raw data is also made available for the slightly bigger studios or those that really want to get to the bottom of a problem and understand how or why a player actually commented that way. We believe that patterns are more powerful than opinions. That one observation and can grow to a sort of a larger pattern, which then can unlock a better experience. That small improvements actually compound over time, and we never underestimate the power of a fresh perspective. So I'm sort of, I guess, as a bit of a wrap up. We understand that great games are built with players, not just for them. Playtesting overall, we we, from the studios that we're talking to, they start to see this as an investment long term, and it's not just a checkpoint in their development pipeline. It actually can lead to some really interesting insights to mitigate risk and to actually drive better games overall. And hopefully, this conversation will have created a little bit of insight to some of the levers that you have and some of the power that playtesting can actually sort of affect in terms of your development titles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, from Playful. That was very, very interesting. Unfortunately, we are a little bit behind in terms of time. So if you do have any questions, and Jeremy, if you have the capacity to stick around, maybe you can answer them in the chat, because I'm just a bit mindful of the schedule. And we have Felicia from Two Frogs in a Trench Coat lined up. In any case, Jeremy, thank you so much. That was really insightful. You've seen the conversations in the chat, and I think there may be a couple of things that people want to follow up on. So thank you so much for taking the time. By the way, if you ever want to talk to Jeremy about engaging him for your studio, feel free to reach out. He's also an IGA member, and we'd be very happy to put you in touch.